There's a quiet tension in the air right now, something most people can feel, but few can fully explain. It's in the headlines we scroll past too quickly, in the conversations we avoid because they feel too heavy, too uncertain. It's that subtle, unsettling question sitting in the back of our minds. Are we standing on the edge of something we don't yet understand? Because history has shown us something we often try to forget. Storms don't announce themselves loudly at first. They gather slowly, almost invisibly, while people continue living as if nothing is about to change. And maybe that's the most dangerous place to be, not in fear, but in comfort. Because comfort can blind us. It can convince us that what we've known will always remain the same, that stability is permanent, that conflict is something that happens somewhere else to someone else. But what if that's not true? What if the world is shifting in ways we're not fully prepared to face? What if the signs are already here, quietly unfolding, waiting for those willing to truly see them? This isn't about creating panic. It's about something much deeper than that. It's about something much deeper than that. It's about awareness. It's about having the courage to sit with uncertainty instead of turning away from it. Because the truth is, ignoring reality has never protected anyone from it. If anything, it leaves us more vulnerable emotionally, mentally, and even as a society. And right now, the question isn't just whether a new war era is possible. The real question is, are we paying attention to the patterns that have led us here before? Think about how often humanity has stood at this exact point, on the edge of something massive, something life-changing, while convincing itself that everything would somehow fit the families. Made plans for the future, all while history was quietly preparing to shift beneath their feet. And by the time it became undeniable, it was already too late to pretend it wasn't happening. But here's why this moment matters so much. Because unlike those who came before us, we have access to more information, more voices, more perspectives than ever before. And yet, despite all of that, it's still so easy to look away. It's still so easy to numb ourselves, to scroll past discomfort, to tell ourselves that someone else will figure it out, that someone else will handle it, that someone else will handle it. But what if awareness itself is a responsibility? What if simply choosing to understand, to stay present, to ask hard questions, to face uncomfortable truths is one of the most powerful things we can do right now? Not because it gives us control over everything, but because it changes how we respond. It changes whether we react out of fear or move forward with clarity. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about politics or power or global tension. It's about people. It's about lives that could be impacted, families that could be changed, futures that could be rewritten in ways no one expects. And whether or not a new era of conflict truly emerges, the way we choose to face this moment, awake or unaware, connected or divided, grounded or fearful, will define far more than the outcome itself. So stay with this. Don't turn away from the discomfort, because what we're about to explore isn't just a possibility, it's a reflection of where we are, and who we might become depending on the choices we make next. We like to believe that stability is something we've earned, that after years of progress, innovation, and global connection, the world has somehow settled into a safer, more predictable place. It's a comforting story. It allows us to wake up each day, follow our routines, make plans, and trust that tomorrow will look a lot like today. But the truth is, stability is often an illusion we build to feel secure, not a guarantee that the world has stopped changing beneath us. Because if you look closely, really closely, you begin to notice the cracks. Not dramatic enough to stop everything, not loud enough to stop everything, not loud enough to force everyone's attention, but present. Tensions between nations that don't quite resolve, conversations filled with underlying hostility instead of cooperation, economic pressures that ripple quietly through societies, creating stress, division, and uncertainty. These aren't random events, they are signals, and history has shown us that before every major shift, before every period of conflict, there's always a phase where everything appears fine. On the surface, that's what makes this moment so complex, because nothing feels completely broken, yet nothing feels entirely steady either. We exist in this in-between space where people sense that something is off, but struggle to define exactly what it is. And instead of leaning into that discomfort, we often do the opposite. We distract ourselves. We normalize it. We convince ourselves that it's just the way the world works now. But what if that normalization is part of the risk? What if getting used to tension is what allows it to grow unchecked? It's easy to think of conflict as something sudden, an explosion, a breaking point, a clear and undeniable shift. But in reality, it rarely starts that way. It builds slowly through miscommunication, competition, fear, and pride. It grows in the spaces where trust begins to erode and where understanding is replaced by suspicion. And during that time, life continues. People laugh, celebrate, plan their futures, all while the foundation beneath them is quietly shifting. The illusion of stability tells us that because nothing catastrophic is happening right now, nothing will. It tells us that we have time, that someone else is managing the situation, that systems in place are strong enough to prevent collapse. And while those systems matter, they are not invincible. They are shaped by human decisions, human emotions, and human limitations. And those are never as predictable as we'd like to believe. There's also a deeper layer to this illusion, the emotional one. Stability doesn't just exist in the world around us, it exists within us. It's a sense of control we cling to, the belief that we understand our environment well enough to navigate it safely. When that belief is challenged, it creates discomfort, and most of us are wired to avoid that discomfort at all costs. So instead of questioning the stability we protect it, we defend it, we tell ourselves that everything is under control, even when small signs suggest otherwise. But awareness requires something different. It asks us to sit in that discomfort without rushing to resolve it. It asks us to acknowledge that just because things feel stable doesn't mean they are. And more importantly, it asks us to stay curious instead of becoming complacent. Because the real danger isn't instability itself, it's the false sense of security that prevents us from recognizing it. It's the belief that this couldn't happen now or we've moved beyond that. Those are the same thoughts that have echoed throughout history right before everything changed. And this doesn't mean we should live in fear or assume the worst. It means we should stay awake. It means we should question what we see, seek understanding beyond the surface, and recognize that peace is something that requires constant awareness, not passive trust. The world doesn't shift all at once. It shifts in moments, small, almost unnoticeable moments that add up over time. And whether we choose to see those moments or ignore them doesn't change the reality of what's happening. It only changes how prepared we are to face it. There's a thin line between fear and awareness, and most of us don't even realize when we've crossed it. Fear is loud, overwhelming, and often paralyzing. It fills our minds with worst-case scenarios, pushes us into panic, and makes everything feel urgent and uncontrollable. Awareness, on the other hand, is quieter. It doesn't rush. It doesn't scream. It simply observes, questions, and understands. But because fear is so much more intense, it's easy to mistake it for being informed, for being prepared, for being awake, and that's where things become dangerous. Because when we operate from fear, we stop thinking clearly. We react instead of respond. We clay into extreme narratives, divide ourselves from others, and lose the ability to see complexity. Fear wants certainty, even if that certainty is false. It wants quick answers, clear enemies, simple solutions. But the world we're living in right now, especially when we talk about the possibility of conflict, is anything but simple. Awareness requires something much harder. It asks us to sit in uncertainty without immediately trying to escape it. It asks us to hold space for multiple perspectives. Even when they challenge our beliefs, it asks us to admit that we don't have all the answers and that the situation unfolding around us is layered, nuanced, and constantly evolving. And let's be honest, that's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to admit that we don't fully understand what's happening on a global scale. It's uncomfortable to acknowledge that decisions being made far beyond our control could shape our future in ways we can't predict. It's uncomfortable to face the reality that the world is interconnected and that no nation, no matter how powerful, is completely isolated from the consequences of global tension. So what do? Many of us turn to fear because it feels like action. It feels like we're doing something, staying alert, staying ready, staying guarded. But in reality, fear often narrows our vision. Staying ready, staying guarded, but in reality, fear often narrows our vision. It keeps us stuck in survival mode where everything becomes a threat and everyone becomes a potential enemy. And in that state, we lose something essential, our ability to think critically, to empathize, to connect. Awareness doesn't take that away, it strengthens it. When we choose awareness, we are not ignoring the risks or pretending everything is fine. We're doing the opposite. We're looking directly at what's happening without distortion. We're asking deeper questions instead of accepting surface level answers. We're recognizing patterns, not jumping to conclusions, and most importantly, we're staying grounded. Because grounded people don't spread panic. They create clarity. They become the ones who can hold steady conversations when others are overwhelmed. They become the ones who can separate fact from noise, truth from exaggeration, and in times of uncertainty, that kind of presence is powerful. It doesn't just help the individual, it influences the people around them. It slows down the spread of fear and replaces it with something more stable, more thoughtful, more human. But awareness also comes with responsibility. Once you see something, once you understand something, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to the comfort of ignorance, and that can feel heavy. It can feel like a burden to carry the weight of reality while others choose not to look at it, yet that's where courage lives, not in knowing exactly what will happen, but in being willing to face the possibility of what could happen without losing yourself to fear. Because at the end of the day, the goal isn't to predict the future perfectly. It's to meet it with strength, clarity, and intention. And that only happens when we choose awareness over fear, not because it's easier, but because it's the only way to stay fully present in a world that is constantly shifting. History has a quiet, persistent way of trying to teach us again and again until we finally choose to listen. It doesn't shout, it doesn't force itself into our daily lives. Instead, it leaves patterns, clues, moments that echo across time, waiting for someone to recognize them. And yet, despite all the evidence, all the stories, all the consequences that have already unfolded before us, we have a tendency to believe that this time is different. We tell ourselves that we are more advanced now, more connected, more informed, that the mistakes of the past belong to a different generation and a different world. And in many ways, that's true. We have evolved, we have grown, but human nature, our fears, our pride, our desire for control and security has not changed nearly as much as we'd like to believe. And that's where the real lesson lies. Because if you look back at the moments that led to major conflicts, they rarely began with a single dramatic decision. They began with small shifts, rising tensions that were dismissed as temporary, disagreements that hardened into divisions, warnings that were ignored because they felt inconvenient or uncomfortable. People didn't wake up one day expecting everything to change. In fact, most believed things would settle down, that someone somewhere would step in and prevent the worst from happening, but history shows us something different. It shows us that denial is powerful, not because it changes reality, but because it delays our response to it. It gives us just enough comfort to stay still when we should be paying attention. It convinces us that acknowledging a problem might somehow make it worse, so we choose silence instead. We choose distraction. We choose to believe that time will fix what we don't want to face. And sometimes that delay is all it takes. What makes this even more challenging is that the early signs of large-scale change rarely feel urgent. They don't come with alarms or clear instructions. They show up as tension in conversations, shifts in tone, subtle changes in alliances, decisions that seem small on their own but carry deeper implications when you step back and look at the bigger picture. And because each moment feels manageable, we don't always connect them. We don't always see the direction they're pointing us toward, but history does. It connects those moments for us if we're willing to look. It shows us how patterns repeat, not exactly the same, but close enough to recognize. It shows us how quickly things can escalate when understanding breaks down, and when understanding breaks down, and when fear begins to guide decisions instead of clarity. And perhaps most importantly, it shows us how often people believe they had more time than they actually did. That's a hard truth to sit with because it challenges the belief that we are always in control, that progress alone protects us from regression. It asks us to consider that awareness is not just about looking forward, but also about looking back with honesty. Not to live in the past, but to learn from it in a way that actually shapes our present. And yet, even with all of this, there's still a choice. We can continue the pattern, ignore the discomfort, dismiss the signals, trust that things will somehow resolve without deeper attention. Or we can do something different. We can pause, reflect, to ask ourselves not just what is happening, but what it reminds us of. We can become more curious about the connections between past and present, instead of assuming they don't apply to us. Because the truth is, history doesn't repeat itself because it has to. It repeats itself because we don't always recognize it in time to respond differently. And maybe that's the real lesson here, not that conflict is inevitable, but that awareness is essential. That the more willing we are to learn from what has already happened, the more power we have to influence what happens next. Not perfectly, not completely, but meaningfully. Because every moment we choose to see clearly instead of turning away is a moment where the pattern has a chance to break. Power is never just about strength. It's about perception, influence, and the constant balancing act between control and responsibility. And when we talk about the role of a nation like the United States on the global stage, we're not just talking about borders or policies. We're talking about since about how one country's decisions ripple across oceans, affecting places, people, and futures far beyond what we can immediately see. There's a weight that comes with that kind of influence, a pressure that isn't always visible, but is always there, because being in a position of global leadership means constantly navigating tension between maintaining peace and projecting strength, between maintaining peace and projecting strength, between diplomacy and defense, between cooperation and competition, and in a world where other powerful nations are also rising, evolving and asserting their own influence. That balance, no country operates in isolation anymore. Every decision is connected to a larger system, aliases, rivalries, economic ties, historical relationships. And within that system, even small shifts can create significant consequences. A strategic movement to protect one interest might unintentionally challenge. An effort to maintain stability in one region might increase tension in another. It's complex, layered, and often filled with difficult choices that don't have perfect outcomes. And this is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable, because it forces us to confront a reality we don't always like to acknowledge. Power can both protect and provoke. The same influence that can prevent conflict can also contribute to it, depending on how it's used, how it's perceived, and how others respond to it. Intent doesn't always translate into impact in the way we expect. There's also the human element within power structures, the decisions made by individuals who carry their own perspectives, pressures, and limitations. Leadership is not just about strategy, it's about judgment. It's about interpreting information in real time, often under immense stress, knowing that the outcomes could shape millions of lives, and even with the best intentions, those decisions are ever made in a vacuum. They are influenced by history, by public opinion, by economic realities, and by the actions of other nations that are equally invested in protecting their own interests. Competition, especially on a global scale, has a way of intensifying everything. It sharpens differences, amplifies mistrust, and creates an environment where every move is analyzed, questioned, sometimes even misunderstood. And in that kind of environment, maintaining peace requires more than just avoiding conflict. It requires constant effort, communication, and a willingness to understand perspectives that may be very different from your own. But understanding doesn't always come easily, especially when fear, pride, and the desire for dominance begin to take hold, because at that point, the focus can shift from cooperation to control, from resolution to winning. And history has shown us that when that shift happens, the path toward conflict becomes much easier to step onto, even if that was never the original intention. This doesn't mean that conflict is inevitable, but it does mean that the dynamics of power are always in motion, always evolving, always requiring attention and awareness. Because the decisions made at that level don't just stay at that level, They move outward, shaping the world in ways that eventually reach all of us. And perhaps the most important thing to understand is this: power is not just about what a nation can do. It's about how it chooses to act when faced with uncertainty, pressure, and the unknown. It's about whether influence is used to build bridges or reinforce divides. And in times like these, those choices matter more than ever, not just for one country, but for the direction the entire world begins to take. When we talk about war, the conversation often stays at the level of strategy, politics, and power. It becomes something distant, maps, numbers, decisions made in rooms most people will never enter. But beneath all of that, beyond the headlines and the speeches, there's a reality we don't always allow ourselves to fully feel. War is not just a decision, it's a human experience. And the true cost of it is not measured in territory or influence, it's measured in lives, it's measured in the quiet moments that never get reported. A parent sitting in a dark room, waiting for a phone call that may never come. A child trying to understand why everything familiar suddenly feels unsafe. A family holding on to normal routines, even as uncertainty presses in from every direction. These are the stories that don't make it into political debates, yet they are the ones that define what conflict truly means. They are the ones that define what conflict truly means. Because every policy, every strategic move, every show of force eventually reaches someone's doorstep. We often talk about soldiers in terms of bravery and sacrifice, and those words are real, they matter, but behind them are individuals with their own fears, their own hopes, their own lives that existed long before they ever wore a uniform. They are not just symbols of strength, they are people who have said yes to something much larger than themselves, often knowing that the cost could be everything, and it doesn't stop their communities change. Entire environments shift under the weight of uncertainty. Schools, workplaces, friendships, everything begins to carry a different kind of tension. Even those far from the front lines feel it in ways that are harder to explain. It shows up in conversations, in the way people look at the future, in the subtle but undeniable sense that the world is no longer as predictable as it once seemed. What makes this even more complex is how easy it is to become emotionally distant from it all. When conflict is discussed in terms of strategy, it can feel abstract, manageable, most like a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be lived. And that distance can make it easier to accept decisions without fully confronting their impact. But when you bring the focus back to people, everything changes, because suddenly it's not about us and them in the way it's often framed. It's about individuals on all sides who are experiencing loss, fear, and uncertainty in deeply personal ways. It's about recognizing that behind every label, every nationality, every role, every nationality, every role, there is a human being navigating something incredibly difficult. And this is where empathy becomes both powerful and challenging. It's powerful because it reminds us of our shared humanity, something that can easily get lost in moments of tension and division. But it's also challenging because it asks us to feel something we might prefer, to keep at a distance. It asks us to stay connected to the emotional reality of conflict, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it doesn't offer simple answers. Because the truth is, once you allow yourself to really see the human cost, it's impossible to view these decisions the same way again. You begin to understand that every choice carries weight beyond what can be calculated, that the impact doesn't end when a decision is made. It continues often for generations, and yet this awareness is not meant to leave us feeling helpless. It's meant to ground us, to remind us that conversations about conflict are not just about outcomes, but about values, about what we prioritize, what we protect, and what we are willing to risk. Because at the center of all of this, beyond the strategies and the power dynamics, is something simple but profound. People living their lives, hoping for safety, for stability, for a future they can believe in. And any conversation about war that loses sight of that is a conversation that has already forgotten war. T truly matters. There's something that happens to a nation when uncertainty lingers for too long. It's not always visible at first. There's no single moment where everything shifts. Instead, it unfolds slowly through conversations, through headlines, through the quiet emotional undercurrent that begins to shape how people see the world around them. And before anyone fully realizes it, that uncertainty turns into tension, and that tension begins to live inside everyday life. You can feel it in the way people talk. Conversations become sharper, more divided, more certain of things that aren't actually clear. Opinions harden, nuance disappears, and suddenly complex global situations are reduced to simple narratives. Clear sides, clear enemies, clear answers. Because when people feel uncertain, the mind looks for something solid to hold on to, even if that certainty is built on incomplete understanding. The media plays a powerful role in this emotional landscape, not necessarily because it intends to create fear, but because attention often gravitates toward what is urgent, dramatic, and emotionally charged. And over time, constant exposure to that kind of information can reshape how people perceive reality. It can make the world feel more dangerous than it is in some moments, or not dangerous enough in others. It can blur the line between being informed and being overwhelmed. And when that line blurs, something deeper begins to happen. People don't just process information, they absorb it emotionally. Fear, frustration, anger, confusion, these feelings start to build, often without a clear outlet. And when emotions don't have a place to go, they tend to look for one. Sometimes that shows up as division. Sometimes as blame, sometimes as withdrawal, where people simply stop engaging because it all feels too heavy to carry. This is what it means for a nation to feel on edge. It's not just about external threats or political tension. It's about the internal emotional state of its people. It's about how individuals begin to navigate their daily lives with a subtle but persistent sense of unease. A feeling that something isn't quite right, even if they can't fully explain why. And the challenge with this kind of psychological environment is that it feeds itself. The more uncertainty people feel, the more they seek certainty. The more they seek certainty, the more they seek certainty, the more they may latch on to extreme or simplified views. And the more those views spread, the more divided the collective mindset becomes. It becomes harder to listen, harder to understand, harder to find common ground. And in that space, tension doesn't just exist, it grows. But here's where awareness becomes essential again, because recognizing this pattern gives us a choice. It allows us to pause before reacting, to question not just the information we're receiving, but how it's affecting us emotionally. It allows us to ask, am I responding to facts or am I reacting to fear? Am I seeking understanding or am I seeking comfort and certainty? These are not easy questions. They require honesty. They require willingness to sit with discomfort instead of immediately trying to resolve it. But they are necessary if we want to stay grounded in a time when everything around us may feel uncertain. Because a nation is not just defined by its policies or its leaders. It's defined by the collective mindset of its people, by how they respond to pressure, to fear, to the unknown. And when individuals choose awareness over reaction, curiosity over assumption, something powerful begins to shift. It doesn't remove the uncertainty. It doesn't eliminate the tension, but it changes how that tension is carried. Instead of spreading panic, it creates space for thoughtful conversation. Instead of deepening division, it opens the door to understanding. And in a world where so much feels unstable, that kind of grounded presence is not small. It's transformative because even in the most uncertain times, how we think, how we feel, and how we respond still matters. And those choices multiplied across millions of people shape the emotional direction of an entire nation. Courage in times like these doesn't look the way we often imagine it. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It doesn't always stand on a stage or make bold declarations. Instead, it shows up in quieter, more personal. At some point, we have to come back to a simple but powerful truth. The future is not something that just happens to us. It's something we're constantly participating in, whether we realize it or not. Every thought we hold on to, every conversation we engage in, every decision we engage in, every decision we make in moments of uncertainty contributes in some small way to the direction we move as individuals and as a collective. When we ask whether a new era of conflict could emerge, the question itself is important. But what matters even more is how we choose to respond to that possibility. Because awareness is not meant to leave us feeling trapped by what might happen. It is meant to remind us that we still had agency in how we show up today. We may not control global systems or the decisions of powerful institutions, but we do influence the environment around us through our awareness, our conversations, and our choices. Unity in this context doesn't mean everyone agrees on everything. It means we remain connected enough to listen, to understand, and to see beyond immediate differences. It means resisting the pull to reduce complex situations into simple divisions and harvest them. Because once that mindset takes over, it becomes much harder to find solutions that consider the full humanity of everyone involved. Responsibility also plays a quiet but essential role here. Not responsibility in the sense of carrying the weight of the entire world on your shoulders, but responsibility in how you engage with the world you are part of, staying informed without becoming overwhelmed, speaking thoughtfully instead of reacting impulsively, choosing understanding over assumption. These may seem like small actions, but collectively, they shape the emotional and intellectual climate we all live in. And perhaps most importantly, awareness reminds us that uncertainty is not something we need to eliminate before we can move forward. It is something we learn to navigate with clarity and steadiness. Waiting for complete certainty often leads to inaction, while rushing in without understanding leads to reaction, while rushing in without understanding leads to reaction. The balance lies in staying present, engaged, informed, and grounded, even when the answers are not fully clear. The direction of the future is influenced not only by major decisions at the highest levels, but also by the mindset of individuals who choose to remain conscious of what is happening around them. When people are aware, they are less likely to be driven purely by fear. When they are grounded, they are more capable of thoughtful responses. And when they are connected to one another through empathy and understanding, this space for division begins to shrink. So while the question of a coming storm may remain open, what is certain is this: the way we move through this moment matters. The future will be shaped not just by events, but by the awareness, responsibility, and unity we bring into the present. And in that sense, the most powerful role any individual can play is to remain awake to reality, steady in uncertainty, and intentional in how they contribute to the world around them. It's important to understand that the future is not written in a single moment, nor is it controlled by one decision, one nation, or one event. It is shaped continuously by patterns, by choices, by awareness, and by the collective direction humanity takes over time. When we ask whether the world could enter a new era of conflict, we are not just predicting an outcome, we are examining the forces that influence how close or how far we move toward it. At the center of this understanding is awareness. Awareness allows us to see beyond headlines and immediate reactions. It helps us recognize patterns that repeat throughout history, and it gives us the ability to pause before jumping to conclusions. Without awareness, we are more likely to be guided by fear, assumptions, or incomplete information. With awareness, we gain perspective, and perspective creates space for better decisions. But awareness alone is not enough. It must be paired with responsibility. Responsibility in how we consume information, how we respond to it, not that must be paired with responsibility. In a world where information spreads rapidly, it becomes easy to react emotionally without verifying, to share opinions without reflection, or to adopt narratives without questioning their depth. Responsibility asks us to slow down, to think critically, and to remain grounded, even when the environment around us feels uncertain. Unity is another essential element in navigating uncertain times. Not unity in the sense of everyone thinking alike, but unity in the sense of everyone thinking alike, but unity in the sense of maintaining connection despite differences. When division becomes the dominant mindset, it becomes easier for fear to grow and harder for understanding to exist. It keeps communication open. It allows space for differing perspectives without turning them into conflict, and in moments where global tension rises, that ability to remain connected becomes incredibly valuable. We also have to recognize that uncertainty is a constant part of the human experience. There has never been a time in history where everything was fully predictable or completely stable. What changes is not the presence of uncertainty, but how we respond to it. Some respond with fear and withdrawal, while others respond with curiosity and awareness. The difference between those responses often determines whether uncertainty becomes overwhelming or manageable. Choosing to remain grounded in the present moment is one of the most powerful things we can do. It doesn't mean ignoring what is happening in the world. It means engaging with it in a balanced way, staying informed without becoming consumed, staying aware without becoming anxious, and staying connected without losing clarity. This balance allows us to think more clearly and respond more thoughtfully rather than reacting impulsively. Ultimately, the direction we move in as a global society is influenced, not only by large-scale decisions, but also by the collective mindset of individuals. When people choose awareness over ignorance, understanding over division, and responsibility over reaction, they contribute to a more stable and thoughtful environment. These choices, repeated across communities and cultures, begin to shape the broader direction of how we navigate uncertain tie. So while the question of a coming storm remains open, the response to it is something we actively participate in every day. By staying aware, acting responsibly, and choosing unity over division, we influence not just how we perceive the future, but how we help shape it.